Hi, I'm Jan Holzbauer. Today I want to share with you a couple of little tips about when you're quilting and you want to butt your seam allowances together. The reason this is important is because if you don't do it, your seams where they come together don't have a good join, and also it's thick. And so when you go to quilt that, it's very hard to quilt through it, and you or your long arm quilter will get very frustrated with you. But when you have pressed them and butted them together properly, it makes for a very nice flat seam, a very nice flat block in your seam, not a very nice flat seam in your block, and then it's much easier to quilt through. The way I do this is once I have chain pieced my pieces together, and I've come along and snipped them apart, I will take them to the ironing board and press them. I'm not going to do that right now, but I'll press them. Generally, the general rule is to press towards the dark. I try to do that when possible, but again, it's not always possible because sometimes in order to get them to lay flatter, I might have to break a rule or two, okay? But what I mean by pressing your seams, you just press one, in one direction. And I'm pressing them the same direction as you can see here. But when I flip this one piece in order to sew this together to make this cute little four patch, the seams are now going in the opposite directions. What I mean by butting the seams up together, I'll pull this back so you can see, is one seam is going to the right, this seam is going to the left. And when you put them together, they just butt up or nest right next to each other, and it's very flat. If you get that off of alignment, I'm going to exaggerate, you get it off of alignment, you can feel it. You can actually feel that it's not flat, and it's thicker. So when you nest them or butt them up together, it lays just really, really flat. Now, if you're more comfortable doing so, you can put a pin right there. I don't usually pin them unless I am chain piecing a whole bunch of these together, and then at that point I will probably put a pin in them just to hold them in place while I'm doing the chain piecing. But for now, I'm going to leave that pin in it just for demonstration. When I take this over to the machine and I start quilting, you can see that I use a little starter piece of fabric just to keep my block from getting pushed down into the throat plate of the machine. And as I stitch that 1/4 inch seam, I remove my pin. When I stitch over that seam, it just stitches very, very flat. And I'm going to do the same thing to these two pieces. I rotate one piece, nest or butt the seams up next together, nest them together, take it over to the machine, and just keep right on stitching. And I will hold my finger on that seam where instead of pinning it, if I didn't pin it, I'll just hold my finger on it until I get to that seam, and then at that point release it. Then I finish off with just slipping another extra little scrap piece of paper in there, a scrap piece of fabric. Snip off my starter piece, and here I've chain pieced these together, snip that apart. Now when I open that up, you can see that that's a very nice join. My points meet here, okay? Now another little tip that I want you to see is this seam allowance right here, where it comes up here in the end. I'm just going to take my seam ripper and remove those stitches. Okay, you'll do that on both sides. Sometimes if I put my finger underneath it, that helps kind of give it a little stability while I'm taking those stitches out. And you'll, like I said, you'll do that on both sides. And when you do that, and you open this up, you can see how this seam right here it pops open. It just lays so nice and flat. Right now I'm just going to give it a little finger press, but you can see one seam is going this direction and this seam is going this direction. Okay, I'll repeat that so you can see it again. Just popping those stitches out of the seam allowance on both sides. And again, when I open that up, this seam will go this way, and that one will go the other direction. And that point, that junction in the center of those lays really, really nice and flat. That's really nice for your long arm quilter or anybody who's quilting your blocks. Here it is after I press them. You know, I press them and one is going one direction, this one is going the other direction, and that lays so very, very nice and flat. Now the beauty of this is, now that you have these 2 4 patches sewn together, you can take your next piece of fabric and line that up. Stitch those 2 together. And you can see that I'm doing this so that when I sew this seam will be going with my feed dogs and not against them. That way the feed dogs can't accidentally flip that seam back up and get in the way or turn it the wrong direction. So I snipped off my little starter piece again, snip my blocks apart, and when I open those up, you can see that I have these the same. I will then press them, and when I have more than, if I press to the dark, generally I would be pressing towards all of this seam junction here. And this is one of those times when I said, sometimes I will go ahead and press just to make things lie flatter. This is one of those cases because there's no seam here. If I press it in this direction, it will lay flatter. Again, I'm just going to give that a little finger press for now. Okay, I'm going to flip those blocks, and I have the exact same process that I did here because just because this one is smaller, I mean these 4 blocks are smaller than this one, when I combine them, I flip that over and my seam allowances will nest or butt up right next to each other. I'll put that pin in them. Get everything lined up. Take that to the machine. And I will sew right up to the pin, but I do not sew over the pin. And when I get to this seam allowance, I'll just hold my finger on it, keep it down until it gets sewn down. And end off on my little starter scrap of fabric. And here I have the exact same process. Now I've got this nice point coming together here. And I will do that little trick in the seam allowance again. I will take that and just take out those stitches on both sides. And flip that over, and when I do, this seam wants to go that way, and this one wants to go that way. And when you press it, everything will lay down nice and flat. Okay. And that's my tip on butting seam allowances and making a nice flat junction for your quilters. Thank you for watching.